By one traditional count, the four Gospels record 37 distinct miracles performed by Jesus of Nazareth: turning water into wine, calming a storm with a single sentence, restoring sight to men born blind, walking on a lake at night, raising 3 different people from actual death. But here's the detail most people skip past. John's Gospel ends by saying flatly that this isn't even close to everything. Jesus did many other things as well, he writes. If every one of them were written down, I suppose the whole world would not have room for the books. So, the Gospels were never trying to give you an exhaustive catalogue. Someone made editorial choices about which miracles made the final cut and which didn't, out of what was likely dozens, maybe hundreds, of witnessed events. 4 different authors selected roughly 3 dozen to write down. That's not comprehensiveness. That's curation. And curation always has a thesis. So what's the actual thesis behind which miracles got kept? And what does the specific arrangement tell you that a simple highlight reel never would? Start with the vocabulary, because the Gospels don't use one word for miracle. They use 3, and the differences matter. The Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, most often use dunamis, meaning power or mighty work. The emphasis falls on the raw display of authority. John almost never uses that word. His preferred term is semeion, sign. The emphasis falls not on the power itself, but on what it points toward. A handful of places use terrors, wonder, or portent, almost always paired with the others as signs and wonders, a phrase borrowed straight from the Exodus narrative describing Moses' plagues before Pharaoh. John goes further than vocabulary alone. He structures his entire gospel around a specific, countable set of signs, beginning with water turned to wine at a wedding in Cana, which he explicitly labels the first of his signs in chapter 2, verse 11. Scholars count 7 of these structuring signs by most reckonings, ending with the raising of Lazarus in chapter 11, before the resurrection itself becomes the sign beyond counting. Matthew, by contrast, clusters a run of 9 miracles, back-to-back, in chapters 8 and 9, immediately after the Sermon on the Mount, seemingly to demonstrate that the authority claimed in the sermon's words matches authority in action. Mark, the earliest and shortest gospel, moves through miracle accounts at a breathless pace, one after another, with almost no interpretive commentary attached. Same underlying set of events. 3 very different editorial strategies for what to do with them. Group the traditional list by category, and a pattern appears immediately. About 6 or 7 are what scholars call nature miracles, power exercised over the physical world itself rather than over a human body. Jesus calms a storm on the Sea of Galilee with a single command: "Peace, be still." He walks across that same lake's surface at night. He feeds a crowd of 5,000 from 5 loaves and 2 fish, and on a separate occasion, 4,000 from 7 loaves. He turns water into wine at Cana and fills empty nets twice on 2 separate occasions years apart. Individually, these read as impressive party tricks if you stop at the surface. But look at the specific Old Testament backdrop most first-century listeners would have caught immediately in the storm story. Psalm 107 says of God alone, "He made the storm be still, and the waves of the sea were hushed." Job 38 has God asking Job, rhetorically, whether he was present when God set limits on the sea and said, "Here your proud waves shall be stopped." In the Hebrew scriptures, commanding the sea into silence isn't a nature trick available to a gifted teacher. It's something only God does. When Mark records the disciples' reaction after the storm as not relief but terror, who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? That question is the entire point of including the story. The nature miracles aren't there to prove Jesus was powerful in some generic sense. They're a specific, deliberate echo of a specific set of Old Testament claims about who alone holds authority over creation. The largest category by far is healing. By most counts, around 24 individual accounts, more than every other category combined. Blindness, leprosy, paralysis, a withered hand, deafness, a severed ear, reattached in the Garden of Gethsemane, the night of the arrest. One account layers in the vocabulary point directly. A woman with a chronic hemorrhage touches Jesus' cloak in a crowd, and Mark records that Jesus felt dunamis, that same word, power, go out from him, before he even turns to see who touched him. Here, the Old Testament echo is even more explicit elsewhere, because Jesus names it himself. When John the Baptist, in prison and apparently doubting, sends messengers asking whether Jesus is really the one they had been waiting for, Jesus doesn't answer with a doctrinal statement. He answers with a list. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised. That's a direct quotation, almost word for word, of Isaiah's description of what the promised age of God's rule would look like when it finally arrived. Chapters 35 and 61. Jesus is telling John's disciples, in effect, don't ask me to describe what I am. Go count what's already happening and match it against the prophecy you already know by heart. Augustine, writing 3 centuries later, pressed the same reasoning further in his commentary on John's Gospel. For Augustine, the healing miracles were never valuable as mere displays of compassion, though they were compassionate. Their real weight was as visible, physical arguments for an invisible claim. A man born blind receiving sight is a sign, in Augustine's reading, of a deeper blindness the whole Gospel is actually about. A smaller but theologically loaded category, about 6 exorcisms, moments where Jesus confronts what the text calls unclean spirits directly, and they leave. One account gives the spirit a name worth pausing on. Legion, the man among the tombs at Gerasa, answers, "For we are many," using the exact Latin-derived term for a Roman military division occupying a foreign land. In a region under actual Roman occupation, that word choice would not have passed unnoticed by a first-century audience. Jesus offers his own explanation for what these encounters mean more broadly, and it's worth quoting exactly because it's more specific than Jesus fought evil. Accused in Mark chapter 3 of casting out demons by demonic power, he answers with a short parable. No one can enter a strong man's house and steal his possessions unless he first ties up the strong man. Only then can the house be plundered. The image is deliberate. Jesus describes the world as a house currently held by a stronger-than-human occupant, and each exorcism as a piece of that house being reclaimed, not a random act of compassion, but evidence of an actual power struggle already underway and already being won. The detail Luke adds after the Gerasene account is deliberately calm. Townspeople arrive to find the man sitting there, clothed and in his right mind. Restoration, not spectacle, is the visible result. The smallest category carries the heaviest theological weight. 3 people are recorded as raised from actual death: a synagogue leader's 12-year-old daughter, a widow's only son at the town of Nain, and, most extensively told, a man named Lazarus in Bethany, dead 4 days by the time Jesus arrives. John spends an entire chapter on this last one, longer than his account of the crucifixion itself, and puts the theological claim directly into Jesus' own mouth before the miracle happens, not after. I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. The raising of Lazarus isn't told primarily as an act of kindness toward a grieving family, though John doesn't hide that Jesus wept at the tomb. It's told as a preview, a sign pointing forward to Jesus' own resurrection a few chapters later, and beyond that, to a general resurrection the tradition holds is still to come. Aquinas, cataloguing miracle types centuries later, place the raisings in their own category precisely because they reverse the one outcome nothing else in nature reverses, which is exactly why the Gospel writers reserve this category for the fewest, most carefully told accounts, rather than the most numerous. So what does a first-century list of miracles ask of someone reading it now, who has never watched a storm go silent on command? Not primarily a request to go looking for the same spectacle repeated on demand. The Gospels themselves are notably restrained about this. Jesus regularly tells people he has just healed to say nothing about it, so often that scholars have a name for the pattern, the messianic secret, and he refuses more than once to perform a sign simply because a crowd demanded proof. That refusal is itself instructive. The miracles were never meant to function as an on-demand vending machine for faith. John states the actual intended function directly in the one verse that operates as a thesis statement for his entire selection. These are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. The signs point. They don't perform on command, then or now. Christian traditions have disagreed for centuries over whether this kind of miracle continues today in the same form. A real and honest disagreement, not one this video is trying to settle. But nearly every strand of the tradition agrees on what the original signs were actually for. Not entertainment, not even primarily comfort, but evidence pointing toward a specific identity claim, offered to people still free to doubt it afterward, as John's own doubting Thomas does 2 chapters later. The practical question the healing miracles put to a reader isn't, "Why doesn't this happen to me?" which is a fair question, but a different one. It's closer to this. If the miracles are a curated argument, has the argument actually been considered on its own terms, or just filed away as ancient folklore before it was ever read closely enough to answer? 37 miracles by the traditional count, and John's own closing line admits it isn't even most of them. If every one of them were written down, I suppose the whole world would not have room for the books. That line is usually read as simple hyperbole, an ancient writer's flourish. Read again after walking through the categories, it does something sharper. It confirms that everything examined here was chosen, not simply preserved. 4 authors, working with overlapping but not identical material, each made a curatorial argument. Mark's breathless pace, Matthew's clustered demonstration of authority, John's 7-sign architecture running from a wedding's wine to an empty tomb. Not one of the 4 claims to be giving you everything Jesus did. Each claims to be giving you enough to notice the Old Testament's fingerprints on a stilled storm. Enough to hear Isaiah's own words handed back as evidence. Enough to watch a house being reclaimed room by room. Enough, John says outright, to believe, or to walk away still unconvinced, as some who watched the originals firsthand apparently did. The miracles were never the whole file. They were the exhibits selected for a specific case. What the four gospel writers seem far less interested in is whether you're impressed by the exhibits. What they're actually asking is whether you've weighed the case.